Tonight on Primetime Politics, hitting back.
We will not stand idly by while our iconic steel and aluminum industries are being unfairly targeted.
The federal government unveils a second wave of counter tariffs aimed at American products, a response to steel and aluminum Trump tariffs that came into effect early this morning. Coming up on the program, we'll speak with two MPs, both from steel-producing cities, to find out how people in their communities are feeling. And we'll speak with industry representatives to get a measure of how painful this trade war will get.
This is going to be a day-to-day fight.
This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. At midnight tonight, nearly $30 billion worth of additional American goods will be subjected to levies in this country, a 25% counter tariff in response to sweeping tariffs applied earlier this morning against Canadian steel and aluminum by the Trump administration.
Today, I am announcing that the Government of Canada, following a dollar-for-dollar approach, will be imposing, as of 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, March 13th, 2025, 25% reciprocal tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion of imports from the United States.
Now, Ottawa says it will not stand by while Trump tries to hurt Canadian steel and aluminum producers and workers. And while the competing tariffs do have the potential of raising prices on both sides of the border, the ministers argue there is something greater on the line.
But let me be clear. This is not something that we want to do. This is not something that we like to do. But it's something that, unfortunately, we are being forced to do in order to protect our way of living in this country. As we have always said, we will continue to stand up for Canada by supporting and defending our workers and our industries, and I would say our way of living as Canadian.
Well, let's get some industry perspective right now. We have in studio with us Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Ms. Cobden, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Ottawa has been quick to react to these tariffs from the United States. What do you make of the measures that you heard today from the ministers?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We were really hopeful that we would respond as a nation right away with the steel tariffs, so we were very pleased about that. We were also hopeful that we wouldn't see an escalation, if you will, in the discussion. We really think this is a time to be calm and measured. And from what we can see from the retaliatory package, it really is like reciprocal in the sense of you put tariffs on that product, we put tariffs on that product. It's 25%, it's 25%. Certainly for the steel aspects of this, that is the case. So, you know, I think that's the right approach. We have to stand up for ourselves. We have to keep the level, you know, we have to stay on level. But escalation is probably not the approach that we would want to see anyway on the steel side. And
in this case, because it's not just Canada giving the counter tariff, the EU is also issuing its own counter tariff. How helpful is that? Yeah,
so, you know, I tend to think that the game afoot is to get the U.S. to realize the importance of the trade and the free trade and the allied trade as much as possible. And so definitely having other nations doing their own retaliatory measures is important, because that will help escalate and get, you know, without it being us and without it being at a level beyond the tariffs themselves. That'll help advance, if you will, the circumstances. At least that's what I hope.
What you hope, and you know, and we heard it before, just how reliant American industry is on Canadian steel. Right. Does that help you in this fight to try to get the tariffs removed, or are you concerned that the United States might be able to quickly source steel from elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why the retaliation is important, because in fact our market's also important to them, and that I think is sometimes lost in their moves at what they're doing. So retaliate first to create that level playing field, and then absolutely, you know, over time I hope that we'll see these tariffs, you know, removed, but I don't have any certainty. As you know, over the last 24 hours, there's been a significant amount of uncertainty created on steel tariffs. Was it going to be 25%? Was it going to be 50%? And so, you know, the 6.6 or 7 million tons of steel we send to the United States is at great risk. And, you know, the 25% tariff will make this very difficult. And so I don't know how the U.S. intends to fill that gap. At 50%, it was like an immediate thing. At 25%, it will be damaging, but might, you know, there may still be some movement of steel, not at the volumes we've had, but there'll be some, I anticipate. But it's a good question. You'll have to pose that to them. I'd like to know where they expect to get that. We know there's an excess of capacity from China, so they could potentially, you know, obviously China would be happy to fill that void. But of course, we also know there's a lot of unfair trade associated with that steel. So. Yeah.
So, you know, as you say, we'll have to see how the Americans respond to it. But in terms of the industry here in Canada, what impact will the tariffs that came into effect at midnight early this morning will have on the industry here and on workers?
Well, it's already had an impact even before we went to bed last night. Unfortunately, the threat of tariffs and then all this volatility has created, you know, I'm going to say, impacts in three distinct ways. One is some job losses. So certain companies have announced already job cuts. We've seen production curtailment, so just, you know, pulling back, not producing as much. And also, and what's really hard to see is the decisions to defer investments until things are less volatile. So those are three really impactful, you know, circumstances on the domestic industry. But I don't want to stop there because I do think there are significant impacts downstream as well, again, in Canada and the United States, as they're also trying to understand where's the steel going to come from, how much will we pay. And as we see prices surge, they've already been surging, you know, I think that's going to become a really interesting challenge. We have a very, you know, difficult economic circumstance for many people. They're really struggling with inflation and you know, how to make ends meet. And at the same time, we're seeing these prices escalate.
So what do you need then from Ottawa? Because, you know, beyond the countermeasures, Ottawa is empowered, as are provincial governments across the country, empowered to do something. What do you hope to get from them?
So thank you for that question, because in fact, with all this volatility, we've come to the determination that we have to actually do what we can control. And what we can control is our own market. And at this moment, there's a lot of unfair trade going on in our market. So Canadian steel producers don't mind, obviously, competing for business. But when we compete with unfair traders where they're dramatically undercutting prices, they're, you know, they don't have employment standards or environmental standards, it's really problematic for us. And so while almost everything we send to the United States, something like 95% of our shipments to the United States is melted and poured in the USMCA region, in our own country, we're only serving like less than 40%, right? So this is something we need with Canadian steel. So we really hope governments of all levels, by the way, prioritize domestic steel, and also that the federal government take measures at our border to get rid, once and for all, of unfair trade in our domestic market.
Well, we certainly know that the Interior Premier as well as the Finance Minister will be speaking to the U.S. representatives tomorrow, so we'll be watching that. But for now, Catherine Cobden, thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Now, earlier today, I also spoke with Francois Racine. He is the president and the CEO of AluQuébec, the group that represents Quebec's aluminum industry. And he says aluminum producers should be okay for now, since Canadian exports supply about 60% of U.S. needs. But more worrying are industries in Quebec that make products out of aluminum and then export them, because even the threat of tariffs has already scared buyers away.
What we're mostly worried, and the members that are more worried about this situation, is our customers who are buying aluminum from the producers and making various products, various components. They're the ones who have competitors within the U.S. who can replace them. And at this point, most of them have literally lost their U.S. exports to other sources, including American manufacturers. So, and that started when the rumor of a tariff was in place. I mean, all the U.S. customers refused to sign any purchasing contract that would refer to potential tariffs. So some of our members have started laying off people working part-time. No closures yet, but who knows? what can help them, and we've been very vocal about this, is making it easier and, in fact, giving preference to local manufacturers when there are purchases from governmental agencies or government ministries. So we're talking at the federal, provincial, municipal level. So make sure that you give preference, and if need be, change the way the system works on the procurement side to give preference to local manufacturers. And again, we'll continue to push for that, because we think short term this is one of the ways where we can mitigate the loss of exports to the U.S., like eliminating the inter-provincial barriers for trade, which is also a factor that is obviously not helping our members.
Now, there will be a meeting in Washington tomorrow, that meeting initiated by the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in a conversation he had with the Ontario Premier Doug Ford. This a direct result of Ford's decision to slap a 25% surcharge on Ontario electricity sold to the United States. And as for the meeting tomorrow, here is what we heard this afternoon from Premier Ford.
Our message down there tomorrow is, let's stop this. It's going to hurt both economies. It's American people that are going to get hurt. Canadians are going to get hurt. Let's sit down and start moving forward on what you want to see in the USMCA and what we want to see in the USMCA.
And as for the Prime Minister designate, he did meet with Doug Ford today. Mark Carney also touring a steel mill in Hamilton, Ontario. And while he has not talked to Donald Trump directly since he's not yet sworn in, this is what we heard from Carney today about any future meeting with the U.S. president.
I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty, and we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade. We're all going to be better off. Workers here in Canada, which is our concern, workers in America, which is his concern, we are all going to be better off.
With that, we are now happy to have on the program Terry Sheehan, the Liberal MP for Sault Ste. Marie, and Matthew Green, the NDP MP for Hamilton. Both communities are in Ontario. Both are steel-producing cities. Hello to both of you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And just a quick note, we did invite the Conservatives to take part. We did not get an MP from them, but we are happy to have both Terry and Matthew here. And Terry, I'll get you to start us out with the discussion, because, you know, Algoma Steel, I don't have to tell you, they announced 20 layoffs last week, and that may seem like a relatively small number, but how worrying is that for the community?
The community is very concerned, and I share their concern. You know, I saw this movie in 2018 when I was the MP for Sault Ste. Marie when Trump put tariffs on steel and aluminum. And I can tell you, I hated that movie then. And I do not like the sequel. It's shaping up to be worse. But in 2018, you know, I saw that same anger, sadness, shock, a multitude of, you know, emotions, and rightfully so, because Algoma Steel at that time, I just had been elected. Algoma Steel was in bankruptcy. The Hamilton Steel people were in a lot of trouble down there too. So when Trump put those tariffs on, you know, it was Algoma Steel and Tenaris, thousands of people that work there, but the multiplier effect in Sault Ste. Marie was enormous, because for every job in the Soo, there's 3 other jobs that support, you know, those steel workers directly and indirectly. And the one thing about the Soo where it's really significant is there's a whole bunch of pensioners and what they call widower pensioners. Those were the people that were really upset and crying then, and really upset now, because they rely on their income. And the next city over, the large city, is Sudbury, 4 hours away. That's a significant place for someone to have to drive if anything ever happened to our steel industry. So that's why I'm fighting tooth and nail right now. You know, you've reawakened the tiger here in Sault Ste. Marie. We were Team Canada. We're Team Canada today. And today we retaliated. And we also have announced supports for workers in the industry. So I can tell you, Michael, that I appreciate the opportunity to come here online, but your observations are absolutely correct, because This is an affront to everything in capitalism and democracy that Trump's doing.
Listen, we'll get it in a bit into the government countermeasures here, but Matthew, I'll get you to pipe in as well, because as you say, Hamilton is another steel producing city. How big of an impact will these tariffs have on your community?
Well, Trump's tariffs are an attack, an economic attack. It's not just a trade dispute. This is actually economic warfare against Canadian workers. And as you've identified, we've been here before. We know what this looks like in Hamilton. And we can't allow our workers to get burned in this process again. I think back, Terry mentioned what happened in 2018. I can go back to when U.S. Steel bought Stelco in 2007. They promised to maintain Canadian production. Instead, they used bankruptcy laws to pick the pockets of the seniors that Terry was talking about in secret deals that essentially sold out through bankruptcy our workers. I think about Hamilton Specialty Bar, who was bought, which was another disaster, was bought by Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's company. We're talking about 4 generations of workers, hundreds of workers, and as was mentioned, the complementary jobs that go with it. They were bought out, they were stripped down, and they were scrapped for parts. This is what happens when we have American-owned branch plants treating Canada like a branch plant economy, where our workers are always cannon fodder for the stock options, the dividends, and the markets of these American, owners. And so we need to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. If public dollars are being used, as was announced, we need to start with EI. We need to fix this system and make sure that nobody falls through the cracks, that people have access to it, and that it's suitable, that it meets their needs for today, and that every dollar that goes to a company is conditional on clear and transparent employment levels and production levels right here in Canada.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned what you're looking for beyond the counter tariffs announced today, worker support, community support. But Terry, you mentioned a bit about the widows' pensions and the concerns. And I've been getting stories about union reps getting phone calls of people in tears, worried about what the future holds for them. Are you finding that when you speak to your constituents?
It's such a challenge anywhere in Canada, these tariffs. But I'm going to talk specifically to the people I represent in Sault Ste. Marie here in Northern Ontario. One of the things that happens, and I've spent my life in business and economic development, doing proactive stuff, but sometimes responding to closures of mills. When mills that are so important to these towns close, people not only lose their job, but they lose the equity in their home. If it happens so that, and Trump was aiming at destroying the steel industry in 2018. And, that's, people in the steel industry here in Canada got it. Like the whole guns were set on them. So we had to respond very strongly with supports for workers, with a SIF program that invested in the steel industry in both Sault Ste. Marie, Hamilton, and the aluminum sector and other steel places, but also, to make sure that we were resilient in what was a very calculated attack to try and destroy our steel industry. And just like we did today, we're responding very strong. We've already identified existing tools in the toolbox, but Mr. Carney also said that all money raised, from the tariffs will be put back into workers and put back into the workers affected. Mm-hmm, and I take a look of comparison to Mr. Poilievre that said that he's going to use the money raised from tariffs to give tax breaks to the rich. I don't think that's very responsible.
Let me jump.
But we're united across this whole country.
And I hear what you're saying, Terry, but Matthew, I'll ask you the question I was trying to get from Terry as well about the stories that you're hearing from people in Hamilton, because, add to that just the cost of living in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area.
Yeah, look, this is people's livelihoods, and the uncertainty alone, as has been witnessed in Algoma, we're going to see it here with National Steel Car. The uncertainty, even the threat of the tariffs, has caused layoffs. It's caused a chilling effect in the purchase contracts that are coming in. So now we have a situation where companies are looking to the longer term perspective. They're not seeing certainty, and they're withholding and withdrawing contracts in Canadian companies right now. Forget about if this thing kicks in down the line April 2nd. This is happening right now. And so we are hearing from people. He mentioned pensioners. I can think about what happened with my own father-in-law who, through CCAA and bankruptcy, lost some of the benefits, which include pharmacare, which include, essential medicines. And so when people are having to make these tough choices about buying their medicine, paying for the increasing costs of food, we have to keep in mind, it's important for every Canadian to keep in mind that these workers, particularly the union folks who negotiated through collective agreements, they traded their present wages for future considerations, including their pensions and benefits. They made that trade-off, and we cannot allow a system through CCAA, should there be shutdowns, should there be closures or bankruptcies, we cannot allow a system that allows workers and pensioners to be left out in the cold simply so that CEOs can pad their pockets in the States. So we need a commitment from the government. I know Terry talked about money coming from tariffs. Hopefully he'll comment on whether or not there's a commitment to fixing the broken EI, but it goes beyond that. USW, Marty Warren, he's calling for expanded work share agreements. We did something like this with the CEWS, with the wage subsidies, but we need to make sure that every dollar that is invested into Canadian corporations here, even if they're American owned, are conditional that it goes to directly supporting the workers that are most impacted.
Listen, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to Terry and ask that question about other supports, because unfortunately we're out of time right now. But I really wanted to get from both of you kind of how communities are feeling right now with these tariffs. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Terry, Matthew, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for having us on.
Well, let's keep talking about the impact of these tariffs as we're now joined by Candace Laing, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Candace, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Listen, these tariffs, they obviously target two specific industries, steel and aluminum, but the impact will be felt wider. Just so let's begin there. Just how big of an impact might these tariffs have on the Canadian economy?
Well, in whole, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we modeled a full 25% retaliatory and back and forth tariff situation, which would impact probably put the Canadian economy into recession even by mid-year. When you look at the impact on our GDP, that's about 2.6%, but it also impacts the US GDP and jobs, of course, on both sides of the border.
Yeah, so into recession, although, there is all this talk about bringing down internal trade, diversifying markets beyond the United States. Will those be enough to help meet the challenge of this moment, of these tariffs that come from south of the border?
That's a great question. I think the value at stake, like the case around that, is very clear and very strong. It's probably a timing issue of, to what pace could we dismantle internal trade barriers, and will that be soon enough on to counter the recessionary impact? But in terms of the value at stake, if we're thinking the 25% scenario hits our GDP at 2.6%, the value, and I would say conservatively, we know is on the table by just dismantling internal trade barriers. That's 4% of our economy, 4% of our GDP.
Yeah, well, it was interesting to hear Francois-Philippe Champagne outline that today in his news conference, because he talked about if you're going to put a tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, well, that's going to have an impact on the cost Americans pay for cars, for their weapons, for building supplies. So, this is not the first time we've been in this regarding aluminum and steel with the Americans. Of course, 2018 was a similar situation. When you look at 2018, is there anything from that experience that you can draw some hope out of? Because I think people are feeling a bit hopeless given the unpredictability of the White House right now.
Yeah, well, it's actually hard to believe we're here seeing this movie again, because we know from the steel and aluminum tariffs that were applied in 2018 that there was a massive net job loss in the U.S. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost because manufacturing depends on inputs in the supply chain that are received from Canada. And I think the bigger picture here that does give me hope that I think Canada needs to turn into. And even more recently, as we have the tariffs put on us by China, I think we steer this into the China conversation because, in fact, President Trump right now may as well hand over North American leadership in steel and aluminum to China. And so aligning on our continental economic security, I think, is an important part to our path forward and way through this.
Yeah, especially since he's used that as the reasoning in terms of applying the tariffs in the first place. You know, Candace, quickly running out of time, but, you know, what can Canadians do right now in this moment? What do you want to see from them? What are you hoping to see from political leaders as well?
Well, coming back to our other conversation about how we can maybe buffer the impact, counter what we're about to go through, which I believe will be bumpy. We'll have to feel and find our way through these regressive impacts of the America First trade policy. But Canadians can double down on our own resolve to bolster our economic security and economic self-reliance and support investments in our own infrastructure and leaning into the natural wealth we have in Canada based on our natural resources and looking how to get those to other markets as we tear down, as we discuss those internal trade barriers.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you say, it's going to be a rough little while. I appreciate you speaking to us today, Candace. Thank you for that.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as I noted earlier, Canada is not the only jurisdiction to levy counter tariffs against the United States today. Trump's levies are targeting steel and aluminum manufacturers around the world, and the European Union, like Canada, is hitting back. Take a listen now to Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission.
Our countermeasures will be introduced in 2 steps, starting with April 1st and fully in place as of April 13th. In the meantime, we will always remain open to negotiations. We firmly believe that in a world fraught with geo-economic and political uncertainties, it is not in our common interest to burden our economies with such tariffs. We are ready to engage in a meaningful dialogue.
And meaningful dialogue is what we'll be watching out for, including tomorrow when the Ontario and federal officials meet with American representatives in Washington. Until then, I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening with that story. Until then, take care.